I've had quite an adventure preparing for this conference, and I decided to scrap everything and start over yesterday. So, I'm really excited about what I've prepared. I feel like I hope that it will inspire some of you to become involved, maybe in history and women's history and international church history. So I want to tell you a little bit more about me to help you understand where I'm coming from. I've never studied Mormon history academically. I'm a public historian, and for those of you who don't know what that means, it means I'm like any other academically trained historian, but I work to bridge the gap between the academy and everyone else. This is usually accomplished through interpretation, so think historic sites, museums, etc. I also have a background in museum studies. My emphasis in museum studies was controversy. I believe in the power of controversy to create dialogue, and through museums and other cultural institutions, we can facilitate healthy dialogue. You may wonder how I came to work for an organization that tends to avoid controversy, but I won't bore you with those details. You should know, however, that I confront controversy every day in my work because of the politics of what history to acquire. It's very complicated. I'm one of 3 global acquisition specialists in the Global Support and Acquisitions Division in the Church History Department. Did you get that? It's my responsibility with a small team of employees and missionaries to acquire historical records and objects for 1/3 of the world, and we already heard that. For the church areas of Asia, Asia North, the Philippines, the Pacific, North America West, North America Northwest, and North America Southeast. And I'll tell you more about what I do in a minute. First, I want to throw out a question to you all. This is something I always ask potential employees. It helps weed people out. Whose history is important? This may seem like a trick question, but it's not. And I'd love to have this conversation with all of you, but that won't be possible today. So again, whose history is important? There are different ways to answer this question, but before I get to that, I want to talk about what makes history important. What makes you care about history, if you do care? When history is relevant, it has meaning and it's important to us. How many of you have had someone you don't know very well recite their family history to you, and about 10 words into the conversation, you've completely tuned out and moved on to something else? That's because it's probably not particularly relevant to you. What happens when history is relevant? How many of you have been changed in some way by a piece of history? Maybe it was reading your grandmother's journal, or a book about a historical figure you admire, or experiencing a historic place, or being in the same room as an object that has historical meaning. These can be powerful, transformative experiences. In some cases, they can even be spiritual experiences. I remember reading the book Lincoln by David Donald for an undergraduate course I took at Weber State. I didn't have any particular interest in Abraham Lincoln, but I remember I finished the book on the anniversary of his death. And that, combined with the understanding I came to have of his life, affected me a lot, to the point that I was emotional about it. And I don't really get emotional about many things, so this is something that I remember. But now I want to transition into Mormon history. Mormon history is interesting because it's somewhat tied to our theology. In those cases, it's very relevant to all Latter-day Saints. A good example of this are the manuals we use in Relief Society and priesthood lessons on Sunday. They're created by compelling experiences and messages from modern prophets to help us gain a better understanding of the gospel. But what about Mormon history moves beyond the prophets and general authorities and works its way out to everyday members of the church? Where is that history, and how can we find it? I want to circle back to the title of my presentation: Are Mormon Women Telling Their Stories? I thought this presentation would give me a good opportunity to dig into the Church History Library's catalog and see how we're doing at conducting oral histories with women. The results didn't surprise me at all, and I should note here that I only looked at oral histories, not other types of records, and I'm sure we have much fewer written records than oral histories from women. But the results of my study were this. As of May of this year, out of approximately 6,700 oral histories, 22% were with only women. 18% were with couples, but I'm not counting those because in my experience, usually the man talks and then the woman bears her testimony at the end. Not always, but most of the time. And then 0.5% were mixed interviews that were like focus groups and things with many women and men. I should note that since I ran this report, we've increased the number of oral histories in the Church History Library's collection to approximately 8,600. So things could be a bit different now, but this is a good place to start. From this, it's easy to see that we, the Church History Department, can do better at collecting Mormon women's stories. I think that's fairly obvious without doing the study. This is something that constantly weighs on my mind, especially at 3 o'clock in the morning when I should be sleeping. I don't know how I could advocate more strongly than I already do for acquiring those records for the Church History Department, and plan ways to seek out more ways to conduct oral histories with women. The good news is that I believe we're situating ourselves to do better, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I think in order to know what kinds of records I need to acquire, I need to stay current on what's happening in Mormondom, good, bad, and everything in between, so I read a lot, especially blogs. I think there's currently a cry for more and better Mormon women's history. Because of current events with ordained women, the recent release of the gospel topic essay about Mother in Heaven and women in the priesthood, and the discussion about how women as leaders fit into the church organization, relevant history of Mormon women can help us understand, inspire, and educate leadership at any level. So 22% is not an acceptable percentage of oral histories from women. We must make the Church History Department's oral history collection more relevant. I shared these numbers with my colleagues in the Global Support and Acquisitions Division this week, and I think seeing the actual number surprised them. We all knew the number was low, but we didn't think it would be that low. I work with some incredible historians, and I know that we will take action to make sure that this changes. I want to make a shift again, and instead of looking only at women, take a gendered look at church history. By this, I mean I want to be inclusive of race, class, and gender. Many of the Church History Department libraries, many of the records in the Church History Library Department collection tell the story of how the church spread throughout the world through the efforts of missionaries. Many, but not all of the missionaries, mission presidents, and early church leaders came from the Wasatch Front or, farther back along the Mormon Trail. And the Church History Department has done a good job of documenting that perspective over the many years of its existence. Approximately 58% of church members live outside the United States. Missionary history is definitely relevant to many because that's how the church spreads, but what about the history of those to whom it was spread to? How can it be accurately recorded by outsiders? And by that I mean someone like myself. I should stop here and ask why it matters who tells the story. Once you have the facts, isn't that all you need? Once the mission president records what happened in a country or area under his stewardship, don't we have the whole story? Absolutely not. There is no truth in history, only evidence and subjective accounts. That is why it's essential to have as many accounts as possible to piece together the mosaic of history. The more pieces you have in a mosaic, the sharper the image, and the same goes for accurate history. So how do we get histories to fill out the historical narrative from many points of view? There's so much work to do. Much more than a few Church History Department employees can accomplish. So a new and better way has been introduced. In 2010, the first presidency gave the Church History Department permission to decentralize. This means that for the first time, church history could be collected, preserved, and shared in the place it was created, instead of being transported to church headquarters. In order to accomplish this work, the Global Support and Training, now the Global Support and Acquisitions Division, was created within the Church History Department. The Global Support and Acquisitions Division is responsible for training and supporting more than 200 church history advisors around the world. Church history advisors are couples or individuals called by the area presidency who work under their direction to collect and preserve and share church history in that area. The Global Support and Acquisition staff support and train them to conduct oral histories, collect records, and perform many other tasks related to collecting, preserving, and sharing church history. In his article on Writing Latter-day Saint History, which I've paraphrased a bit, Leonard Arrington, who was a church historian and recorder, suggested that as the church becomes more international, it will become increasingly important for Latter-day Saints to write the history of the church in their homelands. Reconstructing our lives gives our heirs a sense of their Latter-day Saint heritage, as well as provides real models for their own lives, models with whom they can identify. Or we could say making church history relevant to more members of the church. The decentralization of church history means church pioneers and others are being interviewed by someone who speaks their language and understands cultural nuances that may go unnoticed by outsiders. And again, by outsider, I mean like myself, I'm an outsider. It means that important historical records related to the church globally are being collected, preserved, and shared in places where they are much more accessible to the descendants of those who created them, meaning Latter-day Saints will have the opportunity to have the transformative experiences I talked about earlier, to interact with historical records and objects that help bring more understanding of the church history as well as themselves. This brings us closer to the history of the global church being written and expressed in its proper contexts and becoming more relevant. So what happens when history is expressed in context? I want to spend my last few minutes talking about the power of relevance in history. A couple of years ago, I was working with our church history advisor in the Pacific area. His name is Brett McDonald, and he's been released, and he actually now is here in Salt Lake working in welfare. But he received an assignment from the area presidency to create an exhibit about the history of the church in Samoa. And the idea was that the exhibit would travel around Samoa, it would be shown in stake centers, and it would be an opportunity for people to gather and learn. I've been involved in lots of different exhibits, and this is one of the most successful and amazing exhibits that I've ever seen, so I'm really excited to share a little bit about it with you. So they chose the stories they wanted. They worked with an artist who created these 12 paintings. They put the stories were written in English and Samoan on the panels next to the paintings, and then they invited the Latter-day Saints to come and learn their history. They also invited community leaders and others. And look at that cultural hall full of people. Like I said, I've done a lot of exhibit openings, and rarely have I been to one where it's wall-to-wall people. So this is exciting. And this is what they found. This was the feedback that they received from people who went to this exhibit. I want all of the women in our stake to hear this story. It's a great reminder of the faith Relief Society sisters can have. So here's a woman finding a powerful story about a woman who's going to share it with women to empower them in the place where they live. It's relevant. It speaks to them culturally. It's fantastic. This young women's presidency said, we went around once reading all the stories and looking at the pictures because they were new to us. They went around again to figure out how they could share it with the young women because, again, they want to empower the young women with these stories. I love this one. My husband and I are both returned missionaries. I served as a guide in Missouri at Liberty Jail. I know all of those church history stories, but now I have Samoan stories too. We are writing these down in this book so our children will have them. So to me, this says that she didn't have Samoan stories before, but she has them now. I'm so happy. I'm so happy because I'm leaving to serve a mission soon, and now I have some stories of my own people to take with me. How cool is that? Wherever he goes, he's going to share church history in Samoa with other people. They're going to learn. This is my first time to see or hear anything like this. All these stories are new to me. It's mind-blowing. This is just mind-blowing to me. This is amazing. This is what history can do. This is how history teaches people about who they are, creates spiritual experiences. Now I have a couple more questions for you to think about as we talk about relevance. Do you think this exhibit would have been interesting to you personally? Why or why not? Would you have stood 5 people deep to copy down the stories in 2 languages because you were learning something new about yourself for the first time? I know how I would answer. This is the power of history, and this is why it's essential that all Latter-day Saints tell their stories. Thank you.